50 Comanche warriors surrounded Caleb. Thornfield's ranch at dawn, their war. Paint gleaming in the morning light, and every single one of them wanted the girl he'd hidden in his barn. 3 hours earlier, Caleb had been checking his cattle near Willow Creek when he heard the gunshots echoing across the prairie. Not unusual in Texas territory. Soldiers, bandits, or tribal raids happened weekly. But something about these shots felt different. Desperate. Final, he urged his horse toward the sound, knowing he should ride the opposite direction. Smart ranchers minded their own business in 1876. But Caleb Thornfield had never been accused of being smart. What he found changed everything. A young Comanche girl lay bleeding behind a fallen cottonwood. An army bullet lodged deep in her shoulder. Her buckskin dress was soaked crimson, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. She couldn't be more than 16 with fierce dark eyes that showed no fear, only defiance. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his rifle. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had burned his neighbor's farm and killed Sarah, his wife of 12 years. The smart thing would be to ride away. Let nature take its course. The territory would be safer with one less Comanche. But those eyes, they reminded him of Sarah's, not in appearance, but in their refusal to surrender. The girl tried to crawl away when she saw him, leaving a trail of blood on the dry earth. She spoke rapid Comanche words he didn't understand, but her meaning was clear. Stay back. Caleb dismounted slowly, hands visible. The girl's breathing was getting weaker. Without medical attention, she'd be dead within the hour. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made at her grave, to never let hatred consume what was left of his soul. He scooped the girl into his arms. She fought weakly at first, then went limp from blood loss. Her weight was nothing. She was severely malnourished, probably fleeing with her banned for weeks. The ride back to his ranch felt eternal. Every shadow could hide a war party. Every bird call might signal pursuit, but Caleb pressed on. The girls labored, breathing the only sound between them. At his cabin, he carried her to the barn and laid her on fresh hay. The bullet needed to come out immediately. As he heated his knife in the fire, preparing for crude surgery that would either save her life or end her suffering, the girl's eyes opened. She stared at him with a mixture of confusion and terror. Why was this white man helping her? What did he want in return? Caleb began working on the wound, and the girl bit down on a leather strap to muffle her screams. For 20 agonizing minutes, he dug out bullet fragments while she bled and trembled. Finally, the bleeding stopped. The girl passed out from pain and exhaustion. That's when Caleb heard the war drums in the distance, growing closer with each beat. The drums stopped at sunrise, and that's when Caleb knew they'd found his ranch. He peered through the barn slats and counted them. 50 mounted warriors, painted for war, surrounding his property in a perfect circle. Their leader sat tall on a painted stallion, an older man with gray streaks in his braided hair and scars across his chest. That spoke of countless battles. The girl stirred behind him, fever burning through her small frame. She whispered something in Comanche, her voice barely audible. Caleb didn't need translation. She was calling for her father. The warrior chief raised his hand and the circle tightened. Caleb could see the fury in their eyes. The way their horses stamped and snorted, eager for violence. These weren't raiders looking for cattle or supplies. These were grieving warriors who tracked their missing daughter through 20 m of dangerous territory. Caleb checked his weapons. 1 rifle, 2 pistols, maybe 30 rounds. Total against 50 experienced fighters. He might last 5 minutes if he was lucky. But running wasn't an option anymore. The girl couldn't be moved, and even if she could, they'd never outrun war. Horses across open prairie. The chief called out in broken English, his voice carrying across the morning air like thunder. White man, you have what belongs to us. Caleb's mouth went dry. How could he explain this? That he'd saved their daughter's life, that he'd risked everything to help her. In their eyes, he was just another settler who'd taken something precious from them. He thought about responding, trying to negotiate, but what could he say? That he'd found her bleeding and brought her home. They'd see it as kidnapping. That he'd operated on her wound. They'd call it torture. The girl tried to sit up, wincing from the pain. She looked at Caleb with new understanding. He hadn't saved her. He'd made himself a target. Now both of them would die because of his misguided compassion. Ayanna, the chief shouted, and the girl's eyes filled with tears. She tried to call back, but her voice was too weak to carry. Caleb made a decision that would haunt him. He stepped out of the barn with his hands raised, leaving his weapons behind. 50 arrows tracked his movement. 50 fingers tightened on bow strings. She's alive, he called out. Your daughter is alive, but she's hurt bad. The chief's expression didn't change. If anything, the rage in his eyes intensified. A white man claiming to help his daughter was worse than a white man who'd harmed her. At least enemies were honest about their intentions. You lie, the chief spat. Show her to us. That's when Caleb realized his terrible mistake. If he brought Ayanna out, they'd see the crude surgery, the blood-stained bandages, the way she could barely stand. To them, it would look like torture, not treatment. But if he refused to show her, they'd storm the barn anyway, and the violence would be uncontrollable. Behind him, Ayanna was struggling to her feet, determination overriding her pain. She had something to prove to her father. Something to say that might save both their lives. The question was, would she defend the man who'd saved her, or would she condemn him to save herself? Ayanna stumbled from the barn, clutching her bandaged shoulder, and spoke 3 words in Comanche that made her father's war paint seemed to drain of color. He saved me. The chief's stallion reared as he processed what his daughter had said. For a moment, the only sounds were wind through prairie grass and leather. Creaking as 50 warriors shifted in their saddles, uncertain now about their mission of vengeance. But Caleb could see it wasn't over. The chief's lieutenant, a younger warrior with fresh scalps hanging from his belt, was whispering urgently in their leader's ear. His gestures toward Caleb were clear. This was still a trick, still a trap. Ayanna took 3 shaky steps toward her father and collapsed. The fever was consuming her, and the effort of standing had drained what little strength she'd recovered. Caleb instinctively moved to help her, but 20 arrows swung toward his chest. "Don't!" the chief warned in English. "Don't touch her again." 2 Comanche women dismounted and rushed to Ayanna. They examined her bandages, felt her burning forehead, and spoke in rapid, concerned tones. Caleb watched their faces change as they realized the quality of the medical work, the clean stitching, the proper wound care, the fact that she was alive at all. The older woman looked up at the chief and nodded once. The girl had been treated well, but the lieutenant wasn't satisfied. He rode closer to Caleb, his horse's hooves stopping just inches from the rancher's boots. Up close, Caleb could see this warrior was maybe 25 with angry scars across his face and hatred burning in his eyes like prairie fire. "She is chief's daughter," the lieutenant said in broken English. "You take her, you die. All white men die." Caleb realized this wasn't about Ayanna anymore. This young warrior wanted war, wanted revenge for something that had happened long before today. The girl's rescue had given him the excuse he'd been looking for. The chief was studying Caleb with eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier violence. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why help? Enemy?" It was the question Caleb had been asking himself since he'd first seen Ayanna bleeding behind that cottonwood. Why risk everything for a people who'd killed his wife? Why throw away his life for a stranger? Because she was dying, Caleb said finally. And I couldn't watch someone die when I could prevent it. The chief's expression shifted slightly. Something in Caleb's words had reached him. A father recognizing another man's humanity. But the lieutenant spat in the dirt and raised his rifle. "Lies. White man lies. He keeps her for slave." For the accusation hung in the air like poison. Caleb saw the doubt creeping back into the chief's eyes. Saw the other warriors' faces hardening again. That's when Ayanna spoke again, louder this time, her voice carrying across the silent ranch. Whatever she said made the lieutenant's face go white with rage. And then she said something else that made her father reach for his tomahawk. Ayanna had told her father that the lieutenant was the one who'd led her into the army ambush. And now the young warrior was reaching for his knife. The truth exploded across the ranch like lightning. The chief's tomahawk wasn't meant for Caleb. It was for the traitor who'd gotten his daughter shot. The lieutenant had been feeding information to the cavalry, trading Comanche lives for army gold. And Ayanna had witnessed his betrayal. "You speak lies, girl," the lieutenant shouted, but his voice cracked with panic. "Fever makes you crazy." 3 other warriors were already moving to surround the lieutenant. Whatever Ayanna had said was specific enough, detailed enough that her father believed every word. The chief's face had transformed from anger to a cold, deadly rage that made the morning air feel like winter. But the lieutenant wasn't finished. Desperate men make desperate choices. And he'd rather die fighting than face Comanche justice for treason. His rifle swung toward Ayanna, intent on silencing the only witness to his betrayal. Caleb moved without thinking. 3 years of grief and guilt exploded into action as he tackled the lieutenant from his horse. They hit the ground hard, rolling through dust and prairie grass, fighting for control of the weapon. The ranch erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted contradictory orders. Some wanted to shoot Caleb for attacking their brother. Others wanted to help him stop a traitor. Caleb felt the lieutenant's knife slice across his ribs, but adrenaline numbed the pain. This was the fight he'd been preparing for since Sarah's death. Not against innocent people, but against the kind of evil that destroyed everything good in the world. They rolled again, and the lieutenant ended up on top, pressing his blade toward Caleb's throat. The young warrior's face was twisted with rage and desperation. "You should have minded your own business, white man." Caleb bucked upward, throwing the lieutenant off balance. His hand found a rock the size of his fist. One swing connected with the traitor's temple, and the knife clattered away across the dirt. The lieutenant lay still, breathing, but unconscious. Blood trickled from his head, wound onto the earth that had seen too much violence already. Silence settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. 50 warriors stared at the white man who just risked his life to protect their chief's daughter from one of their own. The chief dismounted slowly and walked to where Caleb knelt, breathing hard from the fight. For a long moment, they looked at each other. Two men who'd lost too much, seen too much, but still recognized honor when they saw it. "You fight to protect my daughter," the chief said simply. "I do it again," Caleb replied, surprising himself with the truth in those words. The chief nodded once, then spoke rapidly in Comanche to his warriors. Half of them dismounted. The other half began preparing to leave. But not in the way Caleb had expected. Ayanna was being helped onto one of the horses despite her protests. She looked back at Caleb with something he hadn't expected to see. Gratitude mixed with genuine sadness. But the chief wasn't done with his surprises. He pulled something from his belt and held it out to Caleb. It was a medicine bag, decorated with beadwork that had taken months to complete. "My daughter says you have lost wife to our people," the chief said quietly. "This cannot bring her back, but it can protect you from dying before your time comes naturally." Caleb stared at the offering, understanding The weight of what was being given. This wasn't just a gift. It was an adoption into protection. A promise that this band would never raid his land again. But as he reached for the medicine bag, gunshots erupted from the ridge overlooking his ranch. 20 cavalry soldiers appeared on the ridge with rifles aimed at the Comanche below. And their commander was shouting orders to fire at will. The trap had been perfectly planned. Someone had told the army about the Comanche war party surrounding Caleb's ranch. And now 50 warriors were caught in the open with nowhere to run. The lieutenant's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had realized. Take cover, Caleb shouted. But the Comanche were already moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, they'd transformed from a ceremonial gathering into a fighting force, using horses and buildings as shields against the rifle fire raining down from above. The chief grabbed Ayanna and pulled her behind Caleb's water trough just as bullets splintered the wood inches from her head. She was too weak to fight, too fevered to run, and now she was trapped in the middle of a massacre. Caleb realized with sick clarity that this was exactly what the lieutenant had planned. Get caught helping a Comanche girl draw the war party to his ranch, then signal the cavalry for a surprise attack. The traitor would be hailed as a hero for leading the army to a decisive victory. But the lieutenant hadn't counted on being exposed as a double agent. Now he was unconscious in the dirt while his carefully orchestrated betrayal played out around him. A Comanche warrior cried out as a bullet found his shoulder. Another's horse screamed and collapsed, pinning its rider's leg beneath its weight. The cavalry had the high ground and superior firepower, but the Comanche had something more valuable. Nothing left to lose. Thornfield. The cavalry commander's voice carried over the gunfire. Step away from the hostiles. We're here to rescue you. Caleb looked at the Comanche warriors around him. Men who'd been ready to kill him an hour ago, but were now fighting to protect his property from destruction. The chief caught his eye and nodded toward the house. Go, the chief said simply. This is not your war. But Caleb was already moving toward his cabin. Not to surrender, but to retrieve his rifle and ammunition. The army thought they were rescuing him. They were about to learn that some rescues weren't wanted. He burst through his front door and grabbed his Winchester along with every box of cartridges he owned. Through his window, he could see the Comanche taking defensive positions around his barn and outbuildings, turning his ranch into a fortress. When Caleb emerged with his rifle, several warriors stared in disbelief. The chief's eyes widened as he understood what the white man intended to do. You choose to fight with us, the chief asked, incredulous. I choose to fight for what's right, Caleb replied, taking aim at the ridge. If you were Caleb, what would you do? Join the army that's supposed to be on your side, or defend the people who came to kill you but showed you honor? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose because what Caleb decided next would determine whether anyone survived the next 10 minutes. The first cavalry charge came like thunder down the hillside in Caleb. Thornfield took his shot. Caleb's first shot dropped the cavalry sergeant, leading the charge, and suddenly 20 soldiers were firing at the man they'd come to rescue. The irony wasn't lost on him as bullets shattered his cabin windows and splintered his porch railings. By choosing to stand with the Comanche, he'd made himself a target of his own people. But watching the chief fight to protect Ayanna with the same desperation he'd once felt trying to save Sarah, Caleb knew he'd made the right choice. The Comanche were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with the precision of men who'd been warriors since childhood. They used every piece of cover, made every shot count, and turned Caleb's ranch into a killing field for anyone foolish enough to charge across open ground. The cavalry commander, a young officer with more ambition than experience, kept ordering frontal assaults that cost him men without gaining ground. After the third failed charge, his remaining soldiers were getting reluctant to follow orders that seemed designed to get them killed. But the lieutenant was waking up, his head wound bleeding, but his betrayal still intact. He crawled toward a fallen soldier's rifle, intent on shooting Ayanna while everyone was distracted by the battle. Caleb saw the movement and swung his rifle around, but he was too far away. The lieutenant's weapon was already rising toward the water trough where the chief's daughter lay hidden. That's when one of the Comanche warriors made a choice that shocked everyone. Instead of shooting at the cavalry, he put an arrow through the lieutenant's chest, permanently ending the traitor's war. The chief looked at the warrior who'd killed his own band member and nodded grimly. Justice had been served in the middle of chaos. The battle was turning. The cavalry had lost 7 men to the Comanches, 2, and their ammunition was running low. But the Comanche were almost out of arrows, and several warriors were wounded badly. Enough that they could barely hold their weapons. Caleb was down to his last box of cartridges when he heard something that changed everything. More horses approaching from the east. At first, he thought it was cavalry reinforcements, which would mean certain death for everyone defending the ranch. But these weren't soldiers. They were ranchers from the surrounding territory, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire. Men who knew Caleb Thornfield as an honest neighbor, a man who'd helped them through hard winters and shared water during droughts. The cavalry commander tried to wave them off, shouting that he was conducting a military operation against hostile Indians. But the ranchers had eyes. They could see Caleb fighting alongside the Comanche. Could see the girl who was clearly wounded and being protected rather than held captive. Old Pete Murdoch, who owned the spread 5 miles south, rode up to the cavalry commander with his own rifle. Ready. What in hell are you doing, soldier boy? That's Caleb Thornfield down there, and he's no Indian fighter. Unless someone gives him cause to be. The commander's authority was crumbling. His men were demoralized. His mission was exposed as something darker than a rescue. And now he had armed civilians questioning his orders. But wounded men with nothing to lose make dangerous enemies. The commander's hand moved to his sidearm, and Caleb realized the officer was prepared to shoot his way out of this situation rather than face a court-martial for attacking innocent ranchers. The chief saw it, too, and their eyes met across the battlefield as they both understood what was about to happen. The cavalry commander drew his pistol on Pete Murdoch, but the chief's tomahawk found his skull before the shot could fire. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, threw down their weapons when faced with 20 angry ranchers who'd known Caleb Thornfield for years. These weren't career soldiers. They were farm boys and drifters who joined the army for steady pay, not to massacre civilians on a Texas ranch. Pete Murdoch dismounted and walked over to where Caleb knelt beside the water trough, checking on Ayanna's condition. The girl's fever had broken during the fighting and her eyes were clearer now, though she was still weak from blood loss. Caleb, Pete said quietly, you want to tell me what this is all about? So Caleb told the story. Finding Ayanna wounded, treating her injuries, the arrival of the war party, the lieutenant's betrayal, and the army's attack on what should have been a peaceful resolution. The other ranchers listened in silence, understanding gradually that their neighbor had risked everything to save a life. The chief approached slowly, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder. He looked at the dead cavalry commander, then at the soldiers sitting in the dirt with their hands raised, then at the ranchers who'd intervened to stop a massacre. This white man, the chief said, pointing at Caleb, has more honor than soldiers who wear blue coats. Pete nodded. Caleb's always been decent folk. If he says the girl needed help, then she needed help. But the situation was far from resolved. 23 soldiers were dead or wounded. A cavalry commander was scalped on Caleb's property, and a Comanche war party was standing in the middle of white ranchers' territory. This was the kind of incident that started wars between entire peoples. The chief seemed to understand this, too. He spoke rapidly to his warriors, who began preparing to leave despite their own wounded. Better to retreat now than wait for more soldiers to arrive seeking vengeance. Wait, Caleb said. He looked at Ayanna, who was strong enough now to sit up on her own. She's not ready to travel. The wound could reopen. The chief's jaw tightened. Every minute they stayed increased the danger, but his daughter's life was worth more than tactical advantage. We take that risk, he decided. But Ayanna had something to say about her own fate. She struggled to her feet and spoke in Comanche. Her voice carrying the authority of a chief's daughter. Despite her youth, whatever she said made her father's eyes widen with surprise. She was refusing to leave. She was claiming sanctuary at Caleb's ranch under Comanche law, putting herself under his protection until she was fully healed. The chief looked at Caleb with an expression that mixed respect with deep concern. She chooses to trust you with her life. If anything happens to her, he didn't need to finish the threat. But he also handed Caleb the medicine bag he'd offered earlier, sealing a bond that would change both their lives forever. That's when they heard the sound of more cavalry approaching from 3 different directions. The approaching cavalry turned out to be Colonel Hayes from Fort Griffin, riding with 2 companies in a white flag. He'd come to negotiate, not to fight. Hayes was old army, a man who'd seen enough frontier violence to know the difference between justice and massacre. When he surveyed the scene at Caleb's ranch, the dead soldiers, the Comanche warriors, and the ranchers standing together, he understood immediately that something had gone very wrong with his subordinate's mission. Commander Patterson was ordered to investigate reports of a kidnapping? Hayes said carefully. Not to engage in open warfare against civilians. Pete Murdoch spat tobacco juice in the dirt. Your boy Patterson was fixing to shoot me for asking questions, Colonel. If that chief hadn't put a tomahawk in his skull, we'd be burying white folks, too. The colonel's experienced eyes took in the scene. Ayana's medical bandages, the quality of treatment she'd received, the way the Comanche warriors were protecting rather than threatening her. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a rescue that had turned into a political nightmare. But Hayes had survived 30 years of frontier politics by finding solutions that satisfied everyone's honor without starting wars. He looked at the chief, then at Caleb, then at the medicine bag hanging from the rancher's belt. It appears there's been a misunderstanding, he said diplomatically. The army received information that a white settler was holding a Comanche girl against her will. Clearly, that information was incorrect. The chief nodded slowly. White man saved my daughter's life. We came to honor this act, not to make war. And yet, 23 soldiers are dead, Hayes observed. Because they attacked while we spoke of peace. The chief replied, your commander fired first. Hayes could see the political calculation in the chief's words. Both sides needed a way to end this without losing face or starting a broader conflict. The truth was messy, but the solution could be simple. I propose this, Hayes said. The army officially records that Commander Patterson exceeded his authority and attacked peaceful negotiations. The Comanche returned to their territory. With our apologies for the misunderstanding, Mr. Thornfield continues his life as a respected member of this community. It was a face-saving lie that everyone could live with. The dead soldiers would be honored as victims of their commander's poor judgment rather than heroes of a righteous cause. But Ayana still refused to leave until her wound fully healed. For 2 weeks, she stayed at Caleb's ranch, under the protection of both Comanche law and army guarantee. During that time, something unexpected happened. She began teaching Caleb her language, and he taught her to read English. They shared stories about their peoples, their losses, their hopes for a future where understanding might replace violence. When she finally left, riding strong and healthy back to her father's band, both of them had changed. The chief kept his word about protection. For the rest of his life, no Comanche ever raided Caleb Thornfield's land. More importantly, when other settlers in the territory faced raids or conflicts, they often came to Caleb as a mediator, the white man who'd earned the Comanche chief's respect. Ayanna grew up to become a peace negotiator between her people and the encroaching settlements, using the reading skills Caleb had taught her to understand treaties and legal documents that previous generations had signed without comprehension. And Caleb, he never remarried, but he was never alone. His ranch became a neutral ground where Comanche and white settlers could meet safely to trade, talk, and sometimes find solutions to conflicts that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. The medicine bag the chief had given him still hung from his belt when he died peacefully 30 years later, surrounded by neighbors, both white and Comanche, who mourned the passing of a man who'd proven that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with an ending so surprising you won't forget it anytime soon.